Okay, so for a while now, I've been trying to find a way to make a realistic shoelace for typography inside Cinema 4D. I want to try and find a way to do this to have all that detail, but to still keep the mesh reasonably low poly so we don't bog down our scene. So I want to share with you guys a way that I've found to achieve this effect. We're going to create our own custom displacement maps using Cinema and Photoshop and use that to displace our geometry, creating this nice shoelace weave. Let's jump in and have a play. Alright guys, let's jump straight in and have a play building up this shoelace texture. So the way we're going to do this is by using a displacement map. And what we're going to do is create that displacement map inside Cinema. So let's get started. Alright, the first thing we need to do, let's add a plane into our scene. Now we're going to use this plane to generate a spline path for us. So with that selected, let's hit C to make it editable. And then I'm going to hit NB to reveal our polygons. And these polygons are what we're going to use to make that spline. The next thing we're going to need to do with this plane selected is come to Mesh, Commands, and we're going to triangulate this geometry. And by doing this, you can see we've now got these triangles inside this geometry, and we've also got those splines running diagonally through this. All right, great. What I'm even going to do is jump into my top view, zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to grab my edge selection tool. All right, what we're going to do is grab 3 edges straight up. And then across from the very top point, I'm going to select 4 additional cuts. And now again from that end point, I'm going to select another 3. With that done, let's go Mesh, Commands, Edge to Spline. And you're going to notice as a child of a plane now, we've got this spline. Let's pull that out, and I'm actually going to delete that plane. We're going to get rid of it. Now, first thing you might notice is our axis point is a bit off for this spline because we didn't make it in the center of that plane. So what I'm going to do, we're going to shift our axis. So let's enable the axis. And I'm just going to slide this over. And it looks like about 60 units is perfectly center for us. We'll now turn off that axis mode, come over to our spline, and we're just going to zero out its coordinates. Perfect. Now what we need to do is clean up this spline a little bit. We're going to get rid of all the inside points and just leave the points that are on each corner. You can just delete those inside points. Next, let's grab both our inside points. I'm going to right click and go soft interpolation. You're going to notice that it hasn't changed anything yet. And that's because our spline doesn't have any intermediate points. So let's change that to natural, and you're going to see we've now got this nice curve in our spline. Now, this is looking pretty good for us. Let's jump back into our perspective view for a moment. Now what we need to do is add a capsule into our scene. What we're doing now is making a singular thread that is going to be forming up the stitching pattern of our shoelace. So with our capsule selected, let's change our orientation to +Z so it's running the same direction as our spline. Let's grab ourselves a spline wrap, make that a child of the capsule, and we're going to change our axis to +Z so it's facing the same direction as our capsule. With that selected, let's drop our spline into the spline field of the spline wrap, and you're instantly going to see that capsule jump to the position of the spline. Now we can do a couple of things here. Let's reduce that radius of the capsule a bit. What I'm also going to do is increase our height segments. And this is going to start smoothing out that geometry. All right, let's turn off both that spline wrap and the capsule for a second. Let's select our plane again. And I just want to increase the curve that's happening in this spline. So just by selecting one of our points, we can use those Bezier control tools to just increase the arc that's happening. Nice, this is looking good for us. Now, in my tests, what I found is we need a little bit more distance from this base point. So what I'm going to do is select that. I might just move it 30 units. Now, by holding Shift, that'll allow you to move in increments of 10. I'm going to do the same with our top point. Just move it 30 units away. Let's turn back on our spline wrap. And this is starting to look good for us. We've now got the start of this first piece of thread. And what we need to do before we can go any further is collapse this geometry. So what we'll need is to drop a connect object into our scene. I'm going to pick up the capsule as well as the spline and drop it inside the connect. What I'm going to do by holding down Command is make a copy of this connect just so we can go back to it if we need. But for now, I'm just going to hide that from our scene. And our original connect, I'm going to hit C on that, and that's going to collapse our geometry. Beautiful. Now what we're going to need to do is we need to create a bit of an arc on this thread. So let's grab a bend deformer, drop it as a child of the connect. I'm going to hit fit to parent so it snaps to the size. Now what you're going to find is when you increase the strength, it may not bend exactly the right direction. So what you'll need to do is grab your rotation tool, which you can select by hitting R, and then we're just going to rotate this a bit. I'm holding down Shift to rotate it 90 degrees, and I think we just need to rotate it 90 degrees one more time. Beautiful. I'm going to jump into my 4 views for a second. I'm going to zero out the strength. We'll hit fit to parent and that'll snap it back to the size of our capsule. And we can actually increase this strength again. Now something that is very important is to click keep y-axis length, and what this will do is stop the capsule extending beyond the parameters that we've set for it. Let's jump into our 4 views so we can see what's happening on the right here. I'll solo that out. And what I'm doing is increasing the strength to create a perfect arc. So what we can do is key in 180 into the strength. We've now got this perfect arc happening within our capsule. All right, let's grab our connect, jump back into our perspective view, and we're just going to rotate this 90 degrees. Okay, it looks like our axis point has shifted when we collapsed it inside that connect. So if that happens, we can just reposition this. Hitting E, I've enabled our axis mode again. I'm just going to reposition this so it's nearer the center of this capsule. About there will work nicely for us. Let's untick that axis mode. Now with our connect selected, let's hold down Alt and we're going to drop this into a cloner. And automatically you're going to see we're starting to create that thread. We're starting to create the illusion of this interweaving happening within our capsules. And already you can start to see that thread taking shape. So you can see I'm just pushing this a little bit further on Y to create that overlapping, but to try and avoid any intersecting. Now you may find that Y pushes your clones straight up. So if that's the case, just zero them out and have a play with the X and Z to see which orientation is correct for yourself. Thinking I want this just a little bit tighter. Nice, that's looking good. Now let's increase our count. About 10 should be plenty for us. Now what we need to do is drop this clone inside a symmetry. So by holding down Alt, that'll drop it inside the symmetry. Let's select our clone. I'm just going to move this across so we get this perfect flip of our geometry. We're getting a little bit intersecting, but that should be fine for us. Nice. Now I'm going to drop a camera into our scene and zero out our rotation. Let's make sure we're looking through it. Okay, we actually need to rotate 90. Minus 90. So let's go minus 90 on pitch. And there we go. We're looking directly down at our geometry. So I'm just framing this up in the center for us. This is great. We've now got the basic shape of this thread starting to come to life. So with our symmetry selected, we're going to drop this inside another clone. And this is purely so we can get some contact shadows left and right of our thread that we've created. So let's zero it out on Y this time. So we can see we need to give this a little bit more distance on the X, and this is allowing us to duplicate that thread. Now, because we're in that camera, as long as we don't rotate around, we're going to be able to just move this around so we can frame up the center of this thread. Now we don't want those new clones to be touching our initial thread that we're framing up in the center. We just want to make sure that they're close enough that they're going to be giving some contact shadows to the outside of our thread. All right, great, that's framed up and looking good. I'm actually going to put a protection tag onto our camera just so we don't move it around and lose our framing. And jump out of that for a second. All right, now what we need to do is start setting up our render so we can use that as our displacement map. So the beautiful thing with displacement maps is they work with contrast. All we need is white and black, because what it's going to be doing is interpreting that data and modifying our geometry by using those values. So what we'll do is add another plane into our scene. We'll scale this up so it captures all of our clones, and then we'll just pull it beneath them. And we're purely using this for a completely black background beneath our capsules. Let's add a new texture into our scene. I'm going to turn off the color and the reflectance, and instantly you're going to see that goes black. But just to make sure, we're going to select the luminance and make that completely black. And we're going to apply that to our plane. We can make a copy of that texture. And this time we want this to be 100% luminance. We want this to be perfect white. And we're going to apply that to our cloner. Let's jump back into our camera. We'll have a quick look at what we've got here. You can see it's completely white. We're not seeing any of the details of those threads. So of course what we're going to be using is ambient occlusion. And that's going to allow us to get these nice contact shadows happening around the thread. Let's hit render and have another look at that. And instantly we're getting this really nice detail happening within those inside threads. Now what we're going to want is some deeper shadows and some higher contrast. What we can do is increase our maximum ray length. I'm going to increase that to 1000, and our minimum, I'm going to set that to 200. And we might even add a little bit of extra contrast. And this is just all going to help bring out those contact shadows on the inside of these threads. Let's have another look at that. And there we go. This is exactly what we're after. These nice deep blacks happening. We get this nice wrapping illusion happening inside this geometry. Now one last thing we're going to need to do before we export this to start playing with is to make sure we output a square format image. So all we need to do is make sure the width and height are exactly the same, and we'll get a nice square ratio image. Now by changing the ratio, it's changed how our camera perceives our geometry. I'm just going to pull these over a bit so we can frame up our square so we know exactly what we're going to be rendering out. And what I'm going to do is remove that protection tag from our camera for a second, just so we can frame up this thread. Somewhere around there, we'll hit render, have another look at what we're dealing with. You can see those outside threads aren't making contact with our middle thread, but they're just allowing us to get a little bit of extra detail, create some nicer shadows happening on the outside. All right, so render that out as a flat image, and then we'll jump into the next step. When I was doing my testing, this is one of the flat renders that output, and I was having a bit of a play with. So we're going to use that for our next step. So what we need is two things. We need it to be a perfect square, but what we also need is for it to tile perfectly. So what we're going to do is load up our image inside Photoshop. And what we're going to be doing is soloing out our thread. So by grabbing our rectangle selection tool, I'm just making a selection around and soloing out one of our threads. We'll then hit Command J, and that'll make a new layer based on our selection. I'm just going to hide our background so we can solo out this thread. We'll then hit Command J, and that's going to duplicate our image. Hitting V to bring up our selection tool, and I'm just going to slide this over, holding Shift so it snaps to the edge of our initial image. Beautiful. On our new layer, what we need to do now is flip it. So let's come to Edit, Transform, and we're going to flip it vertically. Beautiful. All right, our displacement map is almost there. Let's grab both our layers, and I'm just going to anchor these to our top left corner. With them both selected, let's hit Command E, and that's going to flatten them. It's going to merge them together. We'll then hit Command J again to make a copy. We're going to be using this copy to find that seamless loop position. So with this copy, I'm going to pull this down, and I'm just trying to find where it perfectly matches back into the image. And somewhere around here is good. We can zoom in a little bit. And we just need to pull it down a little bit further. And somewhere about there is looking really good for us. So by holding down Command, if we click on the window of the image, it's going to make a marquee selection around it. We can then hit Command-Shift-I to invert that selection. We're going to make a mask on that first layer. We can actually delete our copy, and now we're left with a perfect loop. Both top and bottom will align every single time. Alright, but now we're left with this dead space in the image, and we know that we need this to be a perfect square. So let's come up to Image, Canvas Size, and let's look at our pixels. So you can see I ended up outputting this at 4000 by 4000 pixels, so we ended up with a nice sharp image. So we know that we've crept inside this space. We're now dealing with a smaller canvas, so we want to try and avoid scaling up the image. So I'm going to change our canvas to 3500. Just creep it in a little bit. What I'm also going to do is right click on that mask that we applied to our layer and just click Apply Layer Mask. So now we're just left with the geometry. We can then pull this over, anchor it again to that top left corner, and now we're left with significantly less dead space, and this is perfect. Hit Command T so we can edit the shape of this layer, and we're just going to distort it slightly so it perfectly fills our space. Hitting Enter and done, we're now left with our displacement map. So let's save this out. We can just save this out as a JPEG and that'll work perfectly. Alright, let's jump back over into Cinema and I'll show you how we can use this image that we've created to start distorting geometry. Now, like in my thumbnail image, you saw that we were using this shoelace to spell out some text. So let's have a look at doing that. I've got this spline that I prepared earlier, and we're going to be using this for a little test to build up this shoelace texture. Now again, we're going to be using a capsule and a spline wrap to form the base of our geometry. So let's drop both of them into our scene, and we'll make the spline wrap a child of our capsule. Let's change our axis to +Y so it's pointing straight up the same direction as our capsule. And we can drop this S-spline into that spline parameter. Now, one thing we're going to be doing differently this time is in our mode. Rather than fit spline, we're going to keep length. And this is going to maintain all the parameters that we set within our capsule. First thing, let's lower our radius a bit, somewhere around 10 to start with, and then we'll just increase the height. And if I zoom in, you can see that spline underneath, and I'm just increasing the height just so we meet that endpoint. Nice, about there is looking good. Now, of course, we're going to need to give some extra height segments. Beautiful. Now we've now got this nice smooth geometry, but we're not really getting that shoelace vibe from it. It's too round, it's too thick. So I still want to modify our capsule, but I don't want to lose the ability to add extra height segments or change the radius. So all we're going to be doing is coming over to our coordinates, and on X, I'm going to make it 0.3. And what this is going to do is squish our capsule along X, but it's still going to give us control over editing all its properties without needing to make this editable and scale it down that way. Let's jump into our spline wrap. And we're just going to play with the rotation here. Just create a little bit more interest as it's wrapping around. Somewhere about there should work nicely for us. Nice, we've now got just a little bit more interest. We've now just got a nice bit of, we've now got a little bit more bend, a little bit more natural form happening on our capsule. Let's hit the traffic lights on our spline wrap so we can hide that from our scene. All right, now comes the fun part of using that image we created earlier to really bring home this shoelace effect. So let's create a new material and let's open it up. And the first thing we're going to do is turn on displacement. Now let's load up that image that we created inside Photoshop, and you're going to notice instantly in our little display we're getting some feedback as to what this texture is doing to our geometry. Without it, we've got this nice flat smooth sphere, and with it selected, we're punching out those white points of our image, and the blacks sink in. We're able to create some nice depth. So let's apply that to our capsule. I'm going to pull up our interactive render region and just solo out our S here. Now the first thing you're going to notice is this looks very low quality. We're getting all this artifacting happening within the polygons. So what we're going to select inside that material is sub-poly displacement. And instantly what you're going to notice is this really starts to smooth out. We're getting some far nicer feedback from this image. But although we've now got some more detail, this isn't really looking like a shoelace for us. So what we need to do is modify how this texture is being applied to our capsule. So we can affect how this scales by modifying the length in both the U and the V. You can see if I start scaling this down, let's just make this 50% so we can see what that's doing in our image. We're starting to get some tighter knots and it's wrapping a little bit. You can see by pushing this further, we're going to be able to get that shoelace image. So let's go even further. Let's go 50 and 10. How does that look for us? Beautiful. We're starting to see a bit more of that image coming through, but this is punching out far too far for us. So let's load up our texture. We're just going to affect the height here. Let's drop it down to 1 and we'll see how that looks. This now has made our weaves a little bit less intense, but a bit more realistic as it wraps around our S. Now this may still be too big. We can drop this down again. Let's go maybe 25 and 5 and see how that looks. Nice. I hope the resolution's high enough there, guys, but we're now getting this nice shoelace wrapping texture and we're able to create this detail by purely using an image. And I think that's really powerful. We're able to keep our scenes really low but get this nice feedback. It's a great way to start thinking about using displacement maps to create repetitive details that would otherwise be very difficult to model or would result in such a dense mesh that would make it very difficult to manage in your scene. So this is the exact same technique I used in the thumbnail image you guys saw. Created some splines, I wrapped them with a capsule and we shrunk it down on X, rotate them around a little bit, and then we're able to use that black and white image that we've created to displace this very simple geometry to pull off some great detail shots. So I hope that was a bit of fun building up those displacement texture inside Cinema. Really have a heap of control over that final look. All right, thanks guys. I hope you can take something away from it. And I'll see you again soon. Cheers.